Hello, my name is Carole Pollard. I'm an architect and my main field of work is in research and teaching. I'm an Irish Research Council funded PhD student at the School of Architecture in UCD, and the subject of my thesis is Andy Devan, one of the founding partners of Robinson Keefe and Devan Architects. I teach in the Dublin School of Architecture at TU Dublin, and I am the contributing editor for the Irish entries in the Bloomsbury Global Encyclopedia of Women in Architecture, which is due to be published next year. I am part of the Dublin City Council 20th Century Architecture team, which has produced 2 volumes so far in the More Than Concrete Block series. We are currently working on volume 3, which will bring the series from 1972 up to the end of the century. The buildings that I have been researching for volume 2 are primarily office blocks, a building typology that came to dominate the Dublin cityscape in the latter part of the 20th century, and one which radically changed the course of the city and the movement patterns of its citizens. This Heritage Week talk is an attempt to unravel the strands of influence that shaped Dublin's office blocks, an opportunity to look at how and where the office blocks were built and by whom. I will show you some of the office blocks that will appear in volume 3, but I'm also going to delve a little deeper into the office block architecture of Andy Devan. His office blocks of the 1970s are the central focus of my PhD thesis. The whole idea of workplace is something that has been brought into focus as a result of the COVID pandemic. COVID has put the role and purpose of office buildings to the test. It has also exposed the vulnerability of the city centre, and the office workers are no longer there to support the shops and services that give the city a sense of vibrancy and a sense of purpose. Some of us are delighted to be working from home, but others cannot wait to get back to the office, to establish a routine in purpose-built spaces and enjoy the amenities and buzz of the office, rather than sit in a bedroom all day. It will be interesting to watch how we transition back to office working, what COVID-induced changes will become permanent, and how our working lives, in fact our lifestyles, will change as a result. 1960 Dublin was an equally radical time for the workplace. Up until the beginning of that decade, Dublin's main commercial spine ran from O'Connell Street through Westmoreland Street, College Green, and into Dame Street, where purpose-built office buildings housed banks and insurance companies, accountants and bookkeepers. In comparison with the rest of the developed and developing world, Ireland was late to the table in terms of 20th century modernisation. It was not until the early 1960s that Ireland and Dublin began to experience the political and economic changes that had already impacted most of the Western world. Growing support for social structures, i.e. socialism in Europe, and enormous economic investment, primarily from the United States, brought with it a clash of capitalism, socialism, consumerism, and revolution of social structures that saw our cities transformed. Acceleration in technology saw the demise of many traditional industries and the rise of big corporations. Women began to have an increasing involvement in the office-based workforce. The flight to the suburbs, facilitated by the pervasive use of the car, dictated where office buildings were built and who worked in them. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the shapes of cities around the world changed as urban design policies, particularly modernist planning theories promulgated through CIM, the International Congress of Modern Architecture, began to take hold. Categorization of city user functions, commuter, worker, shopper, resident, succeeded with the assistance of political influence at local government levels to reshape cities with the car firmly at the center of placemaking. In the worst case scenarios, cities were ripped asunder by multi-lane road systems, multi-story car parks, and high-rise residential tower blocks with city residents, when not in their cars, moving around via pedestrian underpasses and overpasses. The city, through car-led architecture, became a hostile space, unwelcoming and unsafe. The advent of the multi-purpose monoblock solved problems and exacerbated them. The monoblock provided all the facilities the commuter office worker needed under one roof. Workers arrived in the morning, parked their car in the integrated car park, worked at their desk, ate in the company canteen, and shopped in the retail mall that ran through the lower floors. On sunny days, they smoked their cigarettes in the office plazas or gardens. Those fortunate enough to work in the more successful corporations could swim in the pool, work out in the gym, or play a game of squash in the leisure centre. And at the end of the day, having retrieved their car from the attached multi-storey car park, they retreated to their homes in the suburbs. While cities retained residential pockets, they tended to be the reserve of the very rich or the very poor who worked in the service industries that supported the office buildings and their workers. This description is deliberately cliched and dystopian, but like all fantastical stories, it is built on elements of truth. Ireland's late arrival to the post-war era of economic growth saved Dublin from succumbing to the worst excesses of 1960s city restructuring. And there is a reason why I say only Dublin. Our other cities, Cork, Galway, Limerick, and Waterford, did not have the population mass to support the modern visions of Ireland's leading corporations, and absolutely could not justify the level of investment required to construct and sustain commercial development of international scale. The integrity of Belfast, which was much more stable in economic terms during the 20th century, did, however, suffer as a result of motorway flyovers, bypasses, and injudiciously placed high-rises. But if we stick with Dublin and look what happened there, we need to place office block architecture within its correct context, and we need to consider the other factors at play. The first is traffic. In the 1960s, Dublin experienced horrendous congestion issues. The road network dated from previous centuries, and parking was a free-for-all. In 1963, UK planner Colin Buchanan produced a report that led to the implementation of radical road building schemes in many cities throughout Britain and Ireland, including Dublin. His legacy is evident when we look at Parnell Street, the Patrick Street Clanbrassil Street route, and Cork Street. Road building was facilitated by demolition, and demolition is the second factor we need to bear in mind. The demolition of Dublin began with the clearance of tenement buildings and progressed to the obliteration of entire streets for road widening purposes. The vista of wide open cityscapes literally opened the eyes of developers, presenting them with the solution of how to build big in a historic, fine-grained city like Dublin. And very conveniently, in the 1960s, you didn't need planning permission to demolish. Unregulated demolition was the greatest enabler of development in Dublin City. It was also the reason that new office development occurred in parts of the city that were already relatively prosperous, and not in the many parts of the city that desperately needed revitalization. The fault lay in flawed planning legislation introduced under the 1963 Act, and the fact that Dublin had no development plan to speak of until 1971. The third factor is economics. The economic programs drawn up by T.K. Whitaker and implemented by Taoiseach Sean Lemass established the conditions necessary for the expansion of Ireland's commercial activity, and that activity needed buildings from which to operate. Ireland did not have a strong manufacturing base, and so Indigenous manufacturing corporations did not lead the way in office block construction. Instead, the majority of office blocks built in Dublin in the 1960s and 1970s were either speculatively built and sold to investment companies, or were headquarters buildings for Irish banks and insurance companies. State and semi-state bodies rarely built their own office accommodation, but instead provided a steady and lucrative tenancy supply to the developers. Dublin's most famous office building of the immediate post-war period was Bosauris, designed by Michael Scott and completed in 1953. Commissioned by the newly formed state transport company Chorus Umper Éireann, the building was designed to accommodate the city's new bus station on the ground floor and offices on the upper floors. Sean Lemass, then Minister for Social Welfare, had his office on one of the upper floors, and the building was Ireland's biggest building project in nearly a quarter of a century. But after it was completed, there was a pause. The commercial office development sector did not take off until nearly 10 years later, with an early example being Robin Walker's headquarters for Ireland's Tourist Board on Bord Fáilte, completed in 1963. The building was generally considered to be the first central core building in Ireland. Cores are an important element in office building. As their name implies, they are usually situated at the center of the building, allowing office space to flow around the building's edges, maximizing natural light, and all the secondary services, toilets, stairwells, lifts, and tea stations are located in the core. The core often acts as the structural anchor for the building. Bord Fáilte HQ was demolished in 2018. In 1964, the bar for office building design was raised to dizzying heights with the completion of the American Embassy in Ballsbridge. Designed by American architect John M. Johansen, it is internationally acknowledged as a pioneering work of post-war modern architecture that advanced the global knowledge of architectural precast concrete structure, and was the subject of a Heritage Week talk last year by historian Shane O'Toole. Michael Scott and partners managed the construction of the American Embassy on Johansen's behalf. Becoming Scott Talon Walker in recognition of the roles of Ronnie Talon and Robin Walker, the practice held a premier position as a design-led architectural practice producing high specification, high quality work. Heavily influenced by Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe, their award-winning projects in Dublin during the 1960s and 1970s include the RTE campus at Montrose, Bord Fáilte at Baggot Street Bridge, Abbey Theatre on Abbey Street, the Bank of Ireland headquarters on Baggot Street, Lisney headquarters on St. Stephen's Green, and the PMPA headquarters on Wolfetone Street. Other talented modernist architects who emerged in the post-war period, including Alan Hope, Noel Moffat, Brendan O'Connor, and Owen Buckley and John O'Gorman of Buckley and O'Gorman, failed to make the transition to the commercial thrust of the 1960s. In terms of architectural notoriety, Stevenson, Gibney and Associates was a household name by the mid-1960s. The practice was founded on foot of their appointment in 1962 by means of an architectural competition to design the new headquarters building for the Electricity Supply Board, the ESB, on Fitzwilliam Street. Led by Sam Stevenson and Arthur Gibney, the practice remained embroiled in controversy for most of its life. And at the time of its dissolution in 1976, when Stevenson and Gibney parted ways, it was the largest practice in the country, employing a staff of 130. Their work output ranges from subtle to extreme, including the ESB headquarters in Fitzwilliam Street, Hainault House on St. Stephen's Green, the Institute for Advanced Studies on Burlington Road, Marion Hall in Sandymount, Molyneux House on Bride Street, Agriculture House on Kildare Street, the Bord na Móna headquarters on Baggot Street, the Currency Centre in Sandyford, and the Central Bank on Dame Street, which was finally completed in 1980. In terms of office block output, Stevenson, Gibney and Associates were matched only by one other practice, Tyndall Hogan Hurley. Tyndall Hogan Hurley's commercial wing was led by Brian Hogan, who adopted a different approach to acquiring commissions and was particularly busy during the 1960s and 1970s. Hogan formed close associations with developers and collaborated with several property investment companies. Founded by Donald Tyndall in the 1940s, the practice was joined by Hogan in 1961 and by Richard Hurley in 1968, and went on to become a favourite of the speculative developer. Hogan was described as Dublin's most prolific commercial architect, and the practice was responsible for numerous office buildings, including Lansdowne House in Ballsbridge, Telephone House on Marlborough Street, Canada House on St. Stephen's Green, Oisin House on Pier Street, the Setanta Centre on Nassau Street, amongst many others. Hogan championed a school of architectural thought that separated him from his rivals. He is quoted as saying, "Architects are not artists. We manipulate other people's money and reach some sort of a balance of all the conflicting priorities. At least I have the intention of making buildings you don't really notice. I would say, in fact, that the best building is the one you notice least." Hogan's skills lay in maximizing square footage to satisfy clients and maximizing user efficiency to satisfy tenants. His view that the best building is the one you notice least was not a view shared by the majority of the high-profile architects who preferred to be known for their aesthetic prowess. But it seems that Hogan was not alone, however, in his philosophy. Perhaps it is one of the reasons why there are so many mediocre and sometimes crude office buildings of the period. Of the cohort of architectural practices who make buildings you don't really notice, the work of Tyndall Hogan Hurley best epitomizes the zeitgeist of commercial office block development in Dublin of the 1960s and 1970s. Interspersed with the legion of inconsequential office buildings were a number which made a significant impact for a variety of reasons. Buildings of note include the Sugar Company offices on Earlsford Terrace, the result of an architectural competition won by Boyle and Delaney, raised on a podium and valiantly disrupting the established building plot lines. Desmond Ray O'Kelly's Liberty Hall, which at 16 stories was dubbed Ireland's first skyscraper, and the British architect Schoolhofer and Burley's brutalist Fitzwilton House, now demolished, set at a jaunty angle on Wilton Terrace, and the divisive brutalist monument River House on Chancery Street by Patrick Sheehan, which stood in defiance of Gandon's forecourts and indeed of most Dubliners. It is now also demolished. Within this milieu, architect Andy Devan, best known for his work for the religious orders, was drawn into the world of office block architecture. He approached those commissions with the same intensity that he invested in his churches, schools, and hospital buildings, producing office buildings that had a radical impact on Dublin City. They are Stephen Court on St. Stephen's Green, the Irish Life Centre on Abbey Street, and AIB Bank Centre in Ballsbridge, all designed by Andy Devan of Robinson, Keefe and Devan. Devan was not a typical office block architect. He was a latecomer to the building typology, having been in practice since the 1940s. He was not the darling of any particular developer. In fact, such an arrangement would have been anathema to him. Devan saw himself foremost as a facilitator of high quality architecture. While he accepted and understood the need for tight building budgets, he fully expected that he would be trusted to manage those budgets and deeply resented client interference, either in monetary matters or more particularly in matters of design. For this reason, he found the world of commercial architecture a difficult place. His 3 Dublin office projects are his largest and most complex work, but they regularly left him feeling frustrated and powerless. Devan was appointed to undertake the Stephen Court Commission in 1963. In taking the commission, he had to accept a significant shift in emphasis in the project briefing stages. The primary goal was not to creatively repurpose an accommodation brief into a functional and aesthetically pleasing building, but to design a structure that would exploit the space potential of the site and maximize return on investment. Those demands were compounded by the fact that the site was located in Dublin's historic core, in a part of the city under increasing development pressure and exposed to the potential for controversy. Devan had quite a task on his hands: to manage a potentially inflammatory reaction to the demolition of existing buildings and to design a building that would comply with Dublin's new planning legislation, while at the same time satisfying his clients' cost demands. And most importantly, to produce a building which would respect and complement its context. Stephen Court is first and foremost a building of good manners, deliberately designed to blend into its surroundings. The palette of materials, dark brown brick, bronze windows, and white concrete is somber and respectful. The vertical emphasis of the front facade complements the vertical rhythm of the streetscape, echoing the tempo of the adjacent Georgian houses and a ghost-like memory of the 4 houses that stood there before. The ground floor arcade of 5 full arches, bookended by 2 half arches, takes its cue from the neighbouring stone arch at number 17. The arcade is constructed in white concrete, forming a continuous horizontal band below the first floor windows, which, rather than challenging the adjacent, more subtle Georgian trimmings, succeeds in reading as an accompaniment to the white fanlights, white window reveals, and white painted filigree cast ironwork. The horizontal arcade pairs with the white roof parapet and recessed penthouse story above to bind Devan's composition together. Beneath the arcade, the ground floor facade is recessed and finished entirely in bronze-tinted glass so that the building appears to float above the street. The central portion of the arcade cantilevers out over the footpath, giving dominance to the building entrance. Retail units occupy the ground floor, left and right of the entrance. Devan achieved an incredible feat in terms of density and square footage. He replaced 3 stories with 7, and the entire development runs to 9,300 square meters, almost 100,000 square feet, arranged in 3 blocks. The front block and the rear block run parallel to St. Stephen's Green, but the central 6-story block turned 90 degrees facing eastwards into an internal courtyard, whose north and south sides are edged by the other 2 blocks. The rear block rises to 7 stories with an open ground floor used for parking. There's more car parking in the basement. Duban's success in achieving a building of this height and density without compromising the architectural character of the street is remarkable. Described in 1971 as discreet, distinguished, unflamboyant yet exciting, Stephen Court received universally good reviews in the press on its completion. The level of positive reception was uncommon for an infill building, which required the demolition of houses on one of Dublin's most prestigious streets, and raises the question of how Duban was deemed to have succeeded where other architects and their clients did not. The quiet ease by which Stephen Court occupied its site contrasts sharply with the furore caused by other nearby developments of the time, including the ESB headquarters on Fitzwilliam Street and the demolition of Hume Street. Duban's clients at Stephen Court were Irish Life, and in 1971 they appointed him to design their new headquarters building on Abbey Street. The Irish Life Centre is the largest and most complex of Duban's commercial projects. It was completed in 2 phases, the first in 1978 and the second in 1985. Michael Lucy, whom Duban had first encountered on the Stephen Court project, was the main client contact, and the fluctuations in the temperature of their relationship reflected the pressures of the job. On completion, the Irish Life was the single biggest development on the north side of Dublin City since the days of the gardeners. The challenges faced by Duban and his team reflect the complexity of the task. The lessons learned at Stephen Court provided a primer, but at every level, from site assembly to planning matters, to the preservation and city housing lobbies, to urban and architectural design, to construction challenges, to design team and client management, Irish Life was a steep learning curve for Duban. In terms of its scope and impact, this project was unlike anything he had attempted before. The Commission allowed Duban to test his ideas on urban planning, how function and form can coexist, and how the projected experience of the user informs strategic design decisions. The scale of the Irish Life Centre can be interpreted in many ways. In its most simplistic analysis, Duban's scheme can be seen as a sweeping away of the old established plot grain and the eradication of streetscape and network of laneways and courtyards that service secondary uses in the backlands. However, compared with other office block development of the time in Dublin, the Irish Life has merits in its attempt to acknowledge the scale and the palette of the city. In the first phase, the site had 2 main street edges, Talbot Street and Abbey Street. The second phase extended the scheme to Marlborough Street. By holding the scale of the Talbot Street edge, the historical integrity of that street is retained. New shop fronts replaced old, and new apartments overhead replaced the former living over the shop arrangements of previous generations. The Abbey Street edge had an entirely different context, facing southwards towards the river and impacted by the sweeping curve of the Loop Line Bridge. Duban mediated the different street edge conditions by placing the dominant building, originally intended to be a 12-story tower, but reduced to 9 by the planners, at the centre of the site, with smaller buildings arranged around it. The human scale was retained in the navigable arrangement of routes between the blocks. The spaces around the buildings define the nature of the complex, and where they are successful, greatly enhance the experience. The main entrance plaza, positioned between the 2 Abbey Street blocks, faces south and is dominated by Oisin Kelly's powerful sculpture, Chariot of Life, placed within a pool of water jets. In hierarchical terms, the second plaza is the Secret Garden, a lushly planted oasis at the back of the scheme, which was replicated in the Phase 2 scheme in another garden at the heart of the Marlborough Street block. The least successful urban space is Northumberland Square, named for the residential enclave, which was demolished to make way for the development. Despite holding the entrance to the shopping mall that connects to Talbot Street, the place is bleak. Cars were an important part of the infrastructure of 1960s and 1970s city centre office blocks. In fact, they were compulsory under planning, and the entry ramps to the basement car park have a detrimental effect on that space. Duban was building for a future city, The Irish Life Centre was Ireland's first city monoblock, as discussed at the beginning of this presentation, a single mass accommodating all the needs of the office worker in one building. And it was designed with suburbia specifically in mind. Workers commuted by car and availed of free on-site parking. They ate lunch in one of the canteens, relaxed in the gardens, did some shopping in Talbot Mall, and exercised in the extensive leisure facilities. The AIB Bank Centre project ran on the same timeline as the Irish Life Centre, meaning that for the decade of the 1970s, DeVan was responsible for designing and project managing the construction of the two largest office complexes ever built in Dublin. The AIB headquarters building in Ballsbridge, completed in 1979, was, DeVan declared, the greatest project of his life. AIB Bank Centre, as configured on completion, was a campus-style development of 8 low-rise interlinked office blocks, ranging from 3 to 5 stories in height, in an elegantly landscaped setting. Having been born from the merger of 3 Irish banks, Allied Irish Banks tasked DeVan with designing a scheme which would accommodate the physical amalgamation of 3 historical financial institutions, while simultaneously delivering discrete office facilities for the conglomeration's flagship subsidiaries. Bank Centre campus was one of the most stylish and alluring office developments ever conceived in Ireland, but was entirely demolished in 2019. In the design development stages, DeVan paid careful attention to the surrounding buildings, particularly the RDS across the road. He undertook detailed sketches of its component parts, and those sketches informed the design of the new complex and influenced the selections of materials and the nature of the details. The warm grey hues of the granite and limestone finishes at the RDS led DeVan to choose concrete as the primary building material, with soft grey-coloured mosaic tiles used extensively as the external skin. Structural elements, including the columns which support the concrete frame structure and the beams which projected beyond the facade with upturned ends, were finished in rough bush-hammered concrete. In contrast to the robust crudity of the concrete, the fine-grained, glinting surface of the tiles with chamfered panel edges brought elegance and purity. The impact of large expanses of glass, a necessary requirement in office design to ensure penetration of natural light, was reduced by deeply recessing the dark tinted glazing within the horizontal structural bands. By engineering the structural floor slabs so that they functioned as planter boxes at their external edges, DeVan further tempered the scale, and the building itself became an integral part of the overall landscape. The trailing vines overhanging the planter boxes lent an exotic appeal and introduced a concept that enjoyed wide international use, but that was new to Ireland. The original design for Bank Centre included state-of-the-art dining facilities, a general staff canteen and executive dining rooms, a large leisure complex with heated pool and other exercise amenities, an experimental theatre, and a staff training school with living accommodation overhead. However, by 1977, when the project was under construction, deteriorating economic conditions constrained the development of the site, and neither the leisure centre, nor the theatre, nor the training school were built. Economic recession did not, however, thwart the ambition of AIB executives, who commissioned British office interiors specialists to design the reception areas and executive suites, much to the despair of DeVan. Andy DeVan did not win any major architectural awards for his office buildings. In fact, he preferred to ignore architectural awards. He considered them distasteful. According to one of his colleagues, DeVan believed that the opportunity to design was an award itself. DeVan is best known for his church architecture. St. Vincent's Church in Sutton and Our Lady Queen of Heaven at Dublin Airport are both on the record of protected structures. His educational buildings are numerous and diverse, including St. Mary's National School in Limerick, Gonzaga College in Ranelagh, the Vocational School at Inchicore, and St. Patrick's in Drumcondra. And they set the bar for the design of schools and universities in Ireland. His commercial architecture is less well known and certainly less well appreciated. As we move further away from the 1970s and gain a better perspective on our architectural heritage of the 20th century, I believe DeVan's commercial work will move into the position it deserves. At Stephen Court, he designed one of the most successful urban infill projects in the city, At the Irish Life Centre, he regenerated a large tract of neglected and downtrodden city fabric. And at Bank Centre, he introduced Ireland to the corporate pastoral landscape. Let's hope that Stephen Court and the Irish Life Centre have a brighter future than Bank Centre. Thank you.